Now, I was absolutely gobsmacked and horrified, actually, earlier in the week to read a report in The Australian claiming that Angus Taylor, the Energy Minister, intended naming and shaming Australian companies who don't have a plan to reach net zero emissions by whenever, 2050 or whatever. Well, I'm pleased to say, Rita and James, that I spoke to Angus earlier, and what he is actually proposing is a complete inversion of what The Australian reported. Pretty misleading story, yes. So, or that's certainly Angus Taylor's explanation. Now, what he's saying is that it's not about naming and shaming companies for not reaching net zero. It's naming and shaming companies, virtue signalling companies who say, oh, yeah, of course, we're going to get to net zero by 2030 or 2050. And yet it's pure fabrication. They're doing it to appeal to the mob, but they have no real idea of how to get there. And Angus's point is that this puts ridiculous pressure on the government when all these different companies are coming out and saying, oh, yes, of course, we're going to get to net zero with no idea how to. And what Angus Taylor is saying is the government is purely focused on the how. They're only interested in the how, not these fake timetables and let's get here by when. If you've got a plan to get there, great, let everybody know the plan. But if not, shut up and stop virtue signalling. So an fascinating take, James.
Yeah, look, I think that's really a very different story to what I think we'd been reading there before, and it's very interesting to hear what Angus Taylor had to say on that. I think he's right not only about the government being put under pressure, but I think there's a more practical issue for just everybody else out here in Australia, that when companies go out there and they say, oh, we're going to hit net zero by 2030 or this sort of thing or that sort of thing, you know, and they don't really mean it or they don't have a plan, what they're doing is they're trying to signal to their annual general meeting and not have trouble with shareholders and things like that. And this winds up having distorting effects all across the economy, because then banks start to hear all of this and they say, oh, well, OK, nobody wants to borrow anymore for projects that are going to be, you know, carbon intensive, you know, whether they're coal mines or smelters or anything like that. So we'll stop doing that. And then suddenly finance starts to dry up and then jobs start to dry up. And good on him, I think, for calling out this virtue signaling, which is being driven really from the corporate affairs functions of these corporations, not from the CEO's office. And Rita, you need to stop this sort of thing, because the longer this goes on, the harder we to get finance, the harder it is to get these jobs and projects up. So good on him for calling that out.
Rita.
Well, if that is, in fact, what he's done, I'm not disputing his account of what this policy entails, but the reporting of it has been almost the opposite.
Exactly.
So the communication of this policy, if the journalists are misunderstanding it, perhaps the companies are misunderstanding it and thinking, oh, we need to be even more green, not just in our marketing, but in realities. But, you know, so I'm just a little bit worried about, is there a coherent, clear message here going out if we're getting reports that are just so different? I mean, I don't expect Chris Story to be indulging in fake news of the Australian. That's all I'm saying.
There you go. Well, you've heard it here first. Angus Taylor is saying that the naming and shaming would only be about those virtue signalling companies who say that they're going to do net zero and all the rest, but actually haven't the faintest clue if they will ever do it or how they would get there. I think it's a fascinating yarn. Meanwhile, New South Wales Energy Minister Matt Keane. We've had a few slip of the tongues this morning, James. He this week announced he is giving $750 million. That's your money, our money, New South Wales, sorry, Rita, not your money, but James and my money, to help businesses slash emissions. This is his Net Zero Industry and Innovation program, which is aimed at co-investing with industry to reduce our carbon emissions. So basically wasting money, paying them, well, to try and reduce this ridiculous target. Some calculations, Rita and James, done by What's Up With That to get the world to net zero emissions by 2050, which we keep being told is the aim. The world would have to build 2 nuclear power plants every single day between now and 2050, or 6,000 wind turbines each and every single day until 2050, plus a 3-gigawatt nuclear power plant for backup each and every day until 2050, assuming not one turbine fails, or 500 square kilometres of solar panels each and every day until 2050, plus a 3-gigawatt nuclear power plant for backup. What an absolute joke. These people are clueless and they are destroying our country and our competitiveness with this mad net zero nonsense, Rita.
Yes, and as we know, a lot of them aren't even having the nuclear discussion. So they want all the renewables, but without the nuclear backup. So you just have to question how we're going to really ever get to zero net emissions by their targets without the serious consideration
Matt Keane,
energy.
Earlier on Sky, speaking to Andrew Clennell, said that he started to make noises about nuclear. It was a bit vague, but there are things happening. Noises.
What sort of noises?
Nuclear noises from Matt Green.
Who knows? Yeah, I mean, but you can't have Rowan and Rita. You cannot have any discussion about cutting emissions if you're not going to put nuclear into the mix. Absolutely. And yes, nuclear is expensive. It's capital intensive to get it going. But if you're talking about throwing billions of dollars around on all of these renewable energy zones, which is something that they're pursuing very heavily, 5 of them here in New South Wales that are modeled very much on the same way that they built them in Texas, and we know what happened to Texas a few weeks ago when they had that superstorm come through. You're not talking about creating a robust system that is not going to be vulnerable to shocks, which is what I worry that we're doing. Emissions aside, the more you move away from things like coal and gas that you can turn on and have ready to go, the more you are going to have power that comes in a spiky fashion, that's not reliable, that is more vulnerable to shocks, and that leads to more blackouts. And that also means that companies with aluminum smelters, things like that, they can't rely on it. They shut down, jobs go. It's killer for the economy.
Well, every single windmill and every single solar panel is simply money going straight over to communist China out of Australian consumers' pockets.